Good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming tonight or tuning in. My name is Wendy Auerbach, and I'm very excited to welcome you to our program featuring author Leah Garrett, part of our United Jewish Federation of Tidewater and Simon Family JCC's Leah and Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival. I would like to take a minute to thank the Leah and Bernard Jaffe family for their generous support of our book festival for many years. We have an incredible lineup this year and couldn't make this happen without their support and that of our patrons of the arts. If you're interested in learning more or becoming part of the Patron of the Arts campaign, please speak with any of our staff members on your way out this evening. Have a few housekeeping tips before we begin. We will take your questions for our special guest at the end. If you're watching online, please put your questions in the Q&A found at the bottom of your screen. If you're here with us, please write your question on the index card we left for you and hold it up above your head. The staff will be watching for your questions online and here in person, and they will get them and deliver them up here to me so that I'll just read the question and nobody has to stand up and speak it. I'll be happy to answer as many of your questions as we have time for this evening. And if you're here and we don't get to your question, immediately after our discussion, Leah will be signing books in the corridor where Extra will be available for sale. And now, as our official welcome, we're thrilled to welcome Leah Garrett to our Hampton Roads community tonight. Leah is the director of the Jewish Studies Department at Hunter College, where she is also a professor. Her research focuses on modern Jewish history and culture, and she has published 4 books, as well as numerous articles on Jewish literary history. Her last book, Young Lions, How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel, won and was shortlisted for several major literary awards. Leah lives in New York City with her husband, the thriller writer Adrian McKinty, and their 2 daughters. I'm so excited to be speaking with Leah tonight to discuss her latest book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. I just finished it. It is a fantastic read. It is World War II history. It's a little Holocaust history. It is a thriller in some cases, and about a group of men that no one has ever heard of. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail describing the book. I thought I would just start by asking Leah to explain who were the men who actually made up X-Troop.
Thank you.
Let's start
Okay, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Joe Grossman, and thank you for everyone coming. I was saying when we were driving over here, over the last year and a half, I've probably done 40 Zoom events, either for the book or for Hunter, and this is my first time in person with humans in a year and a half, so it's so very exciting. So thank you for coming. It feels strange and wonderful. So, X-Troop. So in 1942, the war was going badly for the British, and Churchill met with Mountbatten, and they decided that they had to do something pretty extreme to sort of change the tide of the war. And what Lord Mountbatten proposed was that they create a commando unit of German speakers. And sorry, I have allergies, so I'm going to have to take drinks because I'm dry. And the idea with the German speakers would be that this top secret commando unit would be different from other commando units because the men in the unit would be trained both in counterintelligence and as commandos. So the idea was that they would go out there and they would kill and capture Germans, and they would interrogate them on the battlefield. And nothing like that had existed before. So they were different from the American version, which was the Ritchie boys, who were just counterintelligence. These guys would be commandos too. So they would capture them and then interrogate them. And the feeling was that if they did this effectively, they would get really important and crucial data from the captured men in the heat of war. And what Churchill and Mountbatten didn't really think about as they decided to create this commando unit was that the vast majority of German speakers who are in England in 1942 are Jews. So what ends up happening when they create this commando unit is basically every single member of the commando unit is a German or Austrian Jew. Almost all of them came by themselves to the UK as teenagers, many of them on the Kindertransport. They had, I'm sure we'll talk about sort of these pretty sort of typical middle-class German and Austrian Jewish backgrounds. I'm sure we'll get into this too. When the war breaks out, they're interred as possible enemy aliens because they're German. And then finally, they make the decision to create this commando unit. And as we'll discuss, they were top secret, but they were the tip of the spear for the Allied invasion. They were absolutely crucial to the British victory and the American victory in the war. And in fact, after they had their commando training, which I'm sure we'll also talk about because it was very strange and interesting, their commando training, the British military quickly realized that these guys were so important and effective that the high command also made a very unusual decision, which was that unlike other commando units, like 45 Commando, that would fight as their own unit, these guys were so good that they'd be parceled out in 2s and 3s to existing commando units to do all of this really crucial stuff in the war. And just the last general point before we talk more specifically about them, about who they were, was part of why the story hasn't been told before was they were completely top secret. And the way that the British High Command knew that if any of these guys were captured, they would be killed for like 5 different reasons. They'd be killed as commandos because Hitler had created a commando edict to kill on sight any commando. They would be killed as Germans because they were Germans fighting Germans. They would be killed, most importantly, as Jews. And if they had any family still left somewhere in Germany or Austria, the family would be rounded up. So they knew this. The Brits knew this. So the other really odd and important element of the X Troop was that once they were selected by MI5 to be in this commando unit, they were all given about 5 minutes to create new British-sounding names, British personas, backstories of why they had German accents. So they all had to create these very anglicized names. Like one of the men I talk about a lot in the book was originally, he was from Germany, called Manfred Gans, and he becomes Fred Gray. They all did that. They created these names. So a whole other element of the story that is, I think, very interesting and strange is they all had to completely reinvent themselves in this commando unit. And just one last point about sort of why I suggest that people get the book, because I got amazing photographs of all of this. So they left an incredible photographic record of the story of X Troop as well.
And the book does have a lot of wonderful illustrations.
Really wonderful photos and illustrations were shared with the family.
How did you find this? I'm going to back up just a little bit. How did you find this story?
So my last book, which you mentioned, was also about World War II, but it was about Jewish American GIs, but those who became famous writers. It was like about Norman Mailer and Joseph Heller, Herman Wouk. And after I read that book, I thought my next book was going to be about Mad Magazine, because I was really obsessed with Mad Magazine. I interviewed all these guys from Mad Magazine. I was sure it was going to be about Mad Magazine. And then I ended up getting interviewed for this documentary that was on PBS called G.I. Jew, where I talked about Jewish Americans, which I'd written on. And I went down to the Center for Jewish History in New York, just after I'd moved back to New York. And I watched this whole incredible World War II document. Mel Brooks it was just great. I was like, I had one bit in it, but the rest was great. And as I got on the subway going back to our apartment on the Upper West Side, I thought, oh my God, I can't not write about World War II again. I have to keep writing about World War II. And then I'd sort of heard rumors that there was a Jewish commando unit. And I started investigating, and I sort of found like one of the guys had written an autobiography, someone else had a biography, but no one had written the book. And it was just this incredible moment that every historian dreams of when you realize that you get to write the book. That there's a book that needs to be written, which is crucial to understanding World War II, and nobody has written it. So then, as soon as I figured out I got to be the one to write the book, it just flowed. I mean, I got in touch with children of commandos who put me in touch with other children of commandos. I found archives of different members at the Holocaust Museum, at the Imperial War Museum, at the National Archives. And then also while I was writing it, I discovered that there were still commandos alive who I could interview. So I knew I had to actually research and write it very, very quickly. So the whole process took like 3 years, which is really fast for an academic book. But I knew for me the clock was ticking. I had to interview the commandos because they were all in their late 90s when I wrote the book. So, and I got extremely lucky because I went to the archives in the weeks before lockdown. I didn't know lockdown was coming, and I took my iPhone at the Imperial War Museum or the Holocaust Museum. I took little photos while I was at the museum, which you're allowed to do, of all like Montfort guns, this whole archive, and it's really, And so when the book was coming out, and I had to get all the photographs for the book, almost all of them are actually from my iPhone. Because the Holocaust Museum couldn't get back into the archives. It was shut.
Right,
it was shut.
They shut down.
Yeah, so I was so grateful. And I'd done it so arbitrarily. I just like boop, boop, boop. And I got these great photos that are in the book because I just got incredibly lucky every step of the way writing it.
And you must have had a lot of room on your phone.
Yeah, and I had and I took thousands and thousands of photographs.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
And all the archival material I took photos of too, so I had it.
So, do you want to go back? Should we go back to how everybody? You kind of touched on how all of these fellows got to UK.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about once they got there, what their lives were like.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially once the war started.
Yeah. So, X Troop was a troop of 87 men, but I knew I wanted to both tell the whole story of the X Troop because no one had done it, and it was so important to hear these stories of Jews fighting back. And remember, I'm writing this when anti-Semitism is on the rise in America, and I was like, I'm getting my story out there of Jews fighting. So I felt really inspired for this. And then so when I started to write it, though, I realized I had to kind of focus in a bit. So I focused in primarily on 3 of the men, and then tell you the bigger story of maybe 10 of the men. So as I mentioned, look, all of the guys in the troop were survivors of the Holocaust. All of them had their parents made them possible decision to put their kids on trains or smuggle them out or whatever these parents would do to get their kids to safety. Because as we all know, nobody was taking the Jews. There was nowhere to go. And Britain fortunately had a sort of a visa system for younger people. And so many of them got transit visas. They came on kinder transport as well by themselves. So when they first get to the UK, it's actually really good, because they're away from Nazism. They're all terrified and they're worried about their family. For many of them, when they say goodbye to their parents, is the last time they'll see them, but not for all of them. Some of their parents make it out. And so it's okay for the first year or so, but when the war breaks out, Churchill infamously does this decree, and it's called Collar the Lot. And I was saying when we were driving here, Wendy asked how the book was doing. I said, it's doing incredibly well in the UK. Like all the major papers serialized it, BBC, all this press. And I think a lot of it is because of this part of the story that people in the UK don't know about. So what Churchill decides is that all of the German speakers are potentially fifth columns who could be doing havoc against the British. And so they create this system of interviewing and potentially interning all of the Germans. At this point, 85% of the Germans are Jews. And the highest status for those who have to be interned are single men. And of course, all of the guys who are going to be in the X Troop are single men. So all of them, all except for maybe 1 or 2, get interned. All these guys get interned. Most of them get interned in the UK on the Isle of Man, and it's terrible, and it's behind barbed wire, but it's not horrific, and they create cultural stuff. But a number of them get sent to Australia on the Danera ship, which was a voyage of the damned. I interviewed one of the commandos who had been on the Danera ship. It had a completely anti-Semitic British crew. It was just your worst nightmare. And a bunch of them got sent to Canada too, where the internment camps were terrible. So all these guys think they're like safe, and then they're put in these internment camps for like a year and a half. And the Brits only start to let them out after the sort of Parliament debates it after Pearl Harbor, and then the men are let out, and they're told, look, we're going to let you out, and you can join the military. And all of them are burning to join the military because they want to go kill Nazis. Like they want to fight and kill Nazis. But the Brits say, but you guys are still, you're still aliens, so we can't give you arms. You can only be in the Pioneer Corps, which is like a non-labor unit. So all of them then go into the Pioneer Corps, non-labor, building bridges, stuff like that. And it's basically where the Brits put the worst of the worst, like ex-convicts. And then there's this whole group of these like really educated German and Austrian Jews who were fighting and want to be there to fight the Nazis. And so when they're all in the Pioneer Corps, they start telling their commanding officers, look, come on, you got to give me a gun. You got to let me join the military. And they're begging them. One of the guys, Manfred Gans, I write about, like sneaks off and takes the pilot's exam to join the RAF. And he passes, but they figure out who he is. They won't let him join. And then eventually this moment happens with Churchill and Mountbatten, where they say, we're going to create this commando unit of, it's so funny, we're going to call it they created something called the Inter-Allied 10 Commando. And there would be a Belgian unit, there would be a French unit. And the idea was they'd create these units of people who wanted to go back and fight the Nazis because of what they had done. French unit. And then the X troop, they called the British unit, which is so ironic. So they all pretend to be British. And then they find them in the Pioneer Corps, right? They put signs up, they ask commanding officers who's really smart, who's really focused, who knows German. And these guys all put their hands up. And they start taking trains up to London to be interviewed by MI5 and the guy who's going to run the commando unit, this Welsh officer. And then from that sort of hundreds of them, they select the best and the brightest and the ones most burning with the desire to get back and fight. And that's who they end up selecting for the X troop, these 87 guys.
And then, after that, they have to go into their training.
Yes.
Which is, and do you want to say a few? It is very interesting, the fellow who oversaw this. And
oh, yeah. So the training, I mean, every chapter in the book I just found incredible, these stories I was discovering. So the training, look, like I said, these guys are all like cultured, middle-class Jewish guys from Austria and Germany. There's a few from Budapest. And because they're commandos in the British Army don't go to barracks. They're given a few dollars and told to go find your own billets, go find a place to sit in. So their commanding officer is a Welsh guy named Brian Hilton Jones. He's not Jewish, and he's one of the biggest heroes of my book because he just loved these guys. He knew what the story was. He knew how important they were. But because he's Welsh, they decide that they're going to do all their training in this tiny little Welsh village on the coast. And so just the idea, so these guys, right, they're given, 10 minutes to come up with these fake names. As many of them send the interviews afterwards, they couldn't even remember their names or who the other guy was supposed to be. They're all given fake badges for the units they're supposed to be a part of. And then they're sent to this Welsh village. They're given like $5 and say, go find a house to live in. And like, go eat some Welsh food. And
then they're supposed to pretend they're not really German.
Or Jewish.
Or Jewish.
Yeah. Like Manfred Gans, who I'll keep mentioning, he's Orthodox Jewish. And he none of that's, I mean, when I wrote the book, I got close with a lot of the commandos' children. And I sent the book to Manfred Gans' children before it went to press to say, did I represent your dad okay? Because I had a lot of stuff in the book about how his dad was Orthodox Jewish, and now he had to put on the commando uniform. He couldn't eat kosher. He couldn't do any of the religious holidays. And so in the book, I sort of talked about what a struggle it was. And their kids said, it was nothing like that. He knew he was going to fight the Nazis and he would do anything it took. You do what it takes. It wasn't a struggle for him to do this. But the struggle was they had to hide everything that had their names on it. They all had fake addresses. And what I keep trying to reiterate is they're Holocaust survivors. Like the Holocaust is happening at the same time. So they're in Wales, they're going to dances with local Welsh women. They're they're doing this insanely hardcore training because Brian Hilton Jones was totally determined he was going to make them the fiercest commando unit in the army, and he did. And so, but on top of it, unlike other commandos, he's spending time not only teaching them everything like how to jump out of an airplane with a Tommy gun, how to mask on, how to take apart a bomb, how to
they have to do things blindfolded.
Take about guns blindfold. And I give you all the details of this. but they're also being trained in counterintelligence. They're, Montfort Gons is sent to Cambridge to learn how, like, all of the units of the German army, how do you conduct interrogations? How do you get information out? So it's really intense. And at the same time that this is all going on, they're all like worrying obviously about their parents or their siblings or what's happening to them. But Brian Hilton Jones was so focused on this that he did this. He made them the most important, I think, an effective unit in the army.
And then they were dispersed throughout, as you said, they were dispersed throughout the British Army in all the different theaters of war throughout World War II. And one of the things that is so amazing about the book is how Leah condenses large battles like D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge, which, of course, as you know, volumes have been written on. But what you do is you manage to compress it so that you're telling the story of these particular commandos, yet you do get the scope of the battle. Do you want to give one example of some of, and one of the commandos was in a bicycle corps, which I had never heard of.
Yeah, so I can talk. Yeah, so should I talk about D-Day? I can talk about.
Yeah, why don't you talk about D-Day?
Yeah, so almost all of okay, before the war breaks out, a bunch of them are sent to do counterintelligence behind enemy lines. So they're sent along the Normandy coast to gather intelligence. One of the guys gets such crucial intelligence that his military citation literally says, but for the work of George Lane, D-Day would not have gone on as planned. Like, they're sent before the landings to get information. Then in the months coming up to the landings, they're sent to Sicily. So the first group is sent to the Sicily invasion. But the vast majority of them are sent on the D-Day landings with all these different commando units. All of them go to Sword Beach. And I'll just sort of give you an example why they were so unique before I talk about the bicycle troop. So back to Montfort Gons, he's sent with 45 commando with 2 other guys. And as the ship's coming into Sword Beach, it's an absolute carnage by the time his boat lands, because they kind of land a little bit late and they're a little bit to the side of it. And he's been told over and over again, get off the beach, do not stop at the beach. And Montfort Gons is just a complete Superman and focused, and I'm sure I'll talk a lot more about him. But so when they land, he knows the most important thing is to get them off quickly, right? And he's like, I think at this point, he's only had, I can't remember, maybe he's a lieutenant at this point, I can't remember what he is. But they land with the commando unit, with 45 commando unit. And unfortunately, most of the commando unit hasn't been taught this, right? Because most of them are not ex-troopers. So immediately, half of the entire unit is wiped out at Sword Beach. So Montfort Gons runs on ahead, and he sees a bunch of Germans on the beach, and he immediately captures 25 Germans, and then he starts speaking them in idiomatic German. He says, hey, boys, you need to show me where the mines are so we can get off the beach. And the guys are so shocked that there's this guy, like, with a perfect German accent who probably looks German to them, and they respond, and he gets the prisoners, and the prisoners show, and this is what I'm talking about, the counterintelligence and the commando training. So he's interrogating them, and then they get them off the beach, and he ends up saving the other half of the entire commando unit. And so as the guys make their way through the Normandy landings, one of the men I talk about a lot is this guy called Peter Masters, who was from Vienna, from a very cultured family. He was an artist. He comes by himself, as they do. He's interned. And he is just desperate to get back and kill Nazis. And just as the boat's about to leave Southampton, and he's been put with a different commando unit, a guy comes up to him and says, hey, do you know how to ride a bike? And he's like, yeah, I know how to ride a bike. And he says, well, do you want to be part of the bicycle troop? And he's like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. And they give him this, and I have pictures of it, this clunky, horrible, foldable bikes that the British in their craziness thought would be useful. And another commando on another ship said, there's nothing worse you can imagine landing on D-Day with than a bike. So, and it doesn't even have pedals, it's just the worst contraption. But the point of the bike is great. The point is that the members of the bicycle troop are going to ride ahead of everyone else before the sappers, who are the guys looking for mines, before everyone else. And they're going to be the ones who ride to Pegasus Bridge, right? And like my whole book is filled with like, wait, there's a Jewish guy at the front of this thing too? So he's one of the ex-troopers who's put on a bicycle with one other ex-trooper, and the rest, there's like 40 other guys. The bicycle guys have been training for like 8 months together. He's just given it at the last minute. And then they make their way at the Normandy landings, and they ride straight to Pegasus Bridge, which we all know was like this hugely crucial bridge that the Brits had to hold, because if the Germans had it, it would basically mean the Brits would lose. And they get there first. And Peter Masters, this Austrian Jew, is like in the front bikes, getting their way across Pegasus Bridge in the like one of the most crucial moments in D-Day. And it's really fun. I got to know his family too, and I went to their house in Bethesda, Maryland, and I went through all his papers. Most of them were at the Holocaust Museum, but I went to the ones in his house, and I found all these letters he had written to Lord Lovat. Lord Lovat was the famous British guy who was like, had always claimed in the movie The Longest Day that Lord Lovat was the first to cross Pegasus Bridge. And Peter was like, no, it wasn't. It was me. Don't you remember? And then so in Lord Lovat's book, he kind of mentions it too, and he acknowledges it in the letters. But Peter Master, and so, but that was the story of D-Day. Over and over and over again, they were given the most crucial missions. And I say this quote a lot about the book because I think kind of gets it more than anything else. And Peter Master said this about them: where all of the other commandos and soldiers would draw straws before a mission to see who got to stay behind, ex-troopers were drawing the straws to see who got to go ahead. They wanted to do all of that stuff because this was totally personal for them. The war was personal, the clock was ticking. The quicker they beat the Nazis, the quicker they rescue their sister or their cousin or their mother or whatever it is. So they fought with a dedication and self-sacrifice that nobody else did in the war.
They were absolutely fearless. I mean,
totally fearless.
I mean, and it was just amazing. And they often
effective too.
And very effective. I mean, they had their training was more intense than any other commandos in the British Army.
Totally.
Is that correct?
Totally. Yeah.
And there were other secret. There was another secret force called the SOE that had a lot of women in it, and they actually had a lot of failed missions. But the thing that, when we were talking before, that Leah said she was looking into that, but so many of their missions failed. The thing about this is, you think there is no way these guys are going to survive. I mean, they literally would walk in. One fellow walked into a town. You know, there were all those European towns that had snipers all over the place, and he walks in and gets the rest of the Germans to surrender to him.
Yeah, over and over and over again, completely fearless.
Stuff like that. So so D-Day is sort of the end of the war. One of my favorite stories is, who was it that rescued his parents?
Oh, Manfred Ganz again.
Manfred Ganz again.
So Manfred Ganz, and he's sort of one of the three men I focus on. Like I said earlier, he's from an Orthodox Jewish family, really loving family. And it's interesting, he talked about his childhood, and he said that, I thought this was interesting when he said this in an interview, that where other Jewish kids, like with the rise of Nazism, were feeling really scared, of course, he was feeling really scared, but his group was Orthodox, and they were also Zionists. So they were like also learning Hebrew. They were trying to do all these countermeasures to deal with what they saw was happening. His brother ends up going to Israel right when the war breaks out. So when he lands at D-Day, like I said, he's always at the front of every mission, and he's just a complete superhero. They love and respect him in his 45 Commando unit. He leads the way, Battle of the Bulge. He's at the forefront of the battle for Walcheren, which was this really important island that had to be captured so they could get Antwerp as a port so they could do more supplies. But what's happening with him is that when the war breaks out, his parents go into hiding in a Jew-free area where all the Jews have been cleared out. And unfortunately, somebody rats on them, and he gets a letter from the Red Cross. And I got to see all these letters because they were all in the archives, and no one had written about this stuff before. And he gets a letter first saying that his parents had been taken to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And he has this moment, which he talked about, where he said, I'm going to win this war and I'm going to get my parents. That's it. I know where they are. And so everything he did was focused on beating the Nazis because he had to save his parents. So in the last months of the war, he gets a field commission, which is really unusual. The Brits don't do field commissions. But he and all the other ex-troopers, whenever their commanding officers would say, we want to send you to, you're terrific, I want to send you to officer training school, they would say, no, I'm not leaving the battlefield. I'm not going to go to train. They always refused their commissions because they did not want to leave the heat of the battle. So finally, they realize they want to make him an officer, but he's not going to leave, so they give him a battlefield commission. So then he's like a captain or something at this point. The war is ending, or in the final months. Everyone knows the war is going to end. I mean, the horrificness of the Nazis, of what they did in those last months to the Hungarian Jews, don't even get me started. But everyone knows the war is going to end. And he gets a letter from the Red Cross through all these secret channels, because like this is all highly secretive who these guys are, that his parents have been moved to Terezin concentration camp. So the great news is they're still alive. The terrible news is it's another concentration camp, and Theresienstadt is as terrible as all the others, no matter what the Nazis said about it. So the war's not even over, and he just can't take it anymore, and he goes to his commanding officer, and he says, look, I need you to give me a Jeep, and I need to go get my parents. And the guy's like, that's insane. The war is still on. And then he said, nope, I'm going to do it. And the guy's like, okay, it's man for Gans. He kind of gets everything done. Okay, I'm going to give you a Jeep. And so what I discovered in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the help of his family, was he knew that this was really epic, and he decided to keep a diary of this. And so I have this whole chapter in the book, which I do hope you'll get and read, particularly this chapter, which is the story of him driving through.
So he's a driver.
Yeah.
And then they load up the Jeep, and then they get in the Jeep, and the driver says, well, the brakes in this Jeep
the brakes don't even work. It's a terrible car. And they're going into the apocalypse, right? Germany, there's still a war on. It's like the last days of the war. But he is going to go rescue his parents. And it's one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire war, I think. So he keeps a diary of it, and the ride itself is unbelievable. I hope you'll read it, where like they're crossing Russian lines, and Russians haven't seen any Brits. He goes into German towns, and this is like a real tough guy, and he's terrified to see German civilians because he feels they still will kill him. And he makes his way through Germany, across Czechoslovakia, passing back and forth through these lines, and he gets to Terezin concentration camp. And Terezin has only been liberated by the Russians like 5 hours before. Typhoid is now in the camp. And I'm going to let you get the book and read it yourself, but I'm going to just say that this is a very optimistic book. And I do have a photo in the book of Montford with his parents in Israel after the war. So it's really incredible. Oh my God. And after this whole journey, which I hope you'll read about, he said he won his own private war, and he did. But what was really amazing about it is I had heard rumors, because I write on this stuff about a Jew who rescued his parents, but nobody knew what the story was. Like, is that possible? And so it was really incredible. So after he does this, the word gets out to like Eastern European Jews, German Jews, etc. And so after the war, all of these guys are sent to do the denazification work. So these are the guys also, again, like crazy stuff. They're the guys who are capturing the Nazis after the war. They're the guys who are doing the interrogations for the Nuremberg trials. And as Edmond Fredgans is part of this group, and as he goes to different towns in Germany where there's like a few Jews alive and stuff, they've all heard the story of this, and they're like, you're that British Jewish commando. So it was not only like an extraordinary thing he did for his parents, but that the word got out that there could be hope afterwards. Yeah.
No, he was like a Superman. They could have done a comic
about
him.
Yeah, and his life after the war. And part of my intention in writing the book was I wanted to write a book different from standard military histories. And as a woman, as a mother, as a daughter, as a wife, I also wanted to tell the story of who these men were as dads and grandfathers. So the book, I make sure at the end of the book, I'd sort of tell you what they did after the war, because I didn't want it just to be like, the Holocaust story where you just get the tragedy or you just get the war. I wanted to tell the whole story. And he ends up having a great life. He goes to MIT. Like, it's just incredible. And he raises beautiful children and grandchildren.
No, it's got a great ending for the most part. And even what is miraculous is Hilton Davies,
Hilton Jones.
Hilton Jones, the commander who trained all of these guys he is wounded, and they think he's lost.
Yeah, he gets wounded at D-Day, and they think he's lost, and they're bereft because, when I interviewed two of the commanders who were still alive, and the way they talked about Brian Hilton Jones, I realized that he actually became like the father for these guys. Like, he became their father, and he was a really good father. He was real tough, but he was really good. So they just loved him. And when I went to one of the commander's house, while I was writing the book, he showed me the letter of recommendation that Brian Hilton Jones had written for him. And it was like his most prized thing in the world was that this guy who they loved had written him this letter. And Brian Hilton Jones ended up being really important after the war because the British, after the war, though they decide to naturalize like the French.
Yes, this is crazy.
Yeah, so they decide they're going to naturalize the French troop, and they're, the Polish troop they naturalize. They're not going to naturalize the ex-troop. And I'm saying that like in a Yiddish way. They're not going to naturalize the ex-troop. So for the first 2 years after the war ends, when all these guys are doing the denazification stuff, they can't be naturalized. They're all like stateless, completely stateless, and it's gutting to them and terribly sad to them. And Brian Hilton Jones is the one who's constantly writing to the War Office to say, are you kidding me? Like, these guys are so important. How can we not naturalize them? And eventually, by 1947, he wins and he gets them naturalized, but it takes them 2 years, and particularly him fighting them at the forefront.
But it was the underlying reason was anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I write about that. That's one of the strange things about the ex-troop is after the war, almost all of them keep their British names. They don't raise their kids. I was talking to one of their kids yesterday. Again, I've sort of become close with their kids, and he was saying, "Yeah, I didn't know I was Jewish until I spent a week with Peter Masters, and his family was so Jewish." And I was like, "Wait, am I Jewish?" And it was really interesting because I found that the majority of those who stayed in the UK were very much British, raised their kids. I mean, they all fought with Church of England dog tags, so they were buried under crosses. But the ones who emigrated to the United States started to like reclaim their Jewishness, go back to their original names. And I think, that's another thing I sort of figured out when I was writing the book, was that sort of the story of British anti-Semitism is something we don't really know enough about. And I think it really did impact on the story of X-Troop too.
It seems to have, and you really, it's sort of woven through there.
Yeah.
You can kind of
that
see
security.
And then we have a few more minutes before we have to get into questions. But the other part of that, to me, that was interesting was the monument that they wanted to put up in the little Welsh town where they did all the training. And
so they decided, I think 1990, one of them decided, Brian Grant, one I don't really write that much. I think I was so angry about the memorial I didn't write about him very much in the book, but you'll hear why. So he's one of the commandos, and he decides that they're going to pool their resources and create a monument to the X-Troop in the town where they did their training in Wales. And he wouldn't let the word Jewish be on it. Like 95% of the troop was Jewish. They fought as a Jewish troop because it was everything about what they did was Jewish. And so I read all the letters between him and all the sort of surviving ex-troopers wrote letters about this. And they came up with all these reasons, those who were opposed, like, we don't want to be too overt about it, like, we don't want to bring up anti-Semitism, we fought like everyone else did, we weren't so religious. And fighting him was Peter Masters, who said, we're a Jewish troop, you have to say Jewish. Montfort Gons, most of those who came to America wanted the word Jewish in it, and he won. So the monument in Wales, it's a beautiful memorial, does not say the word Jewish. There's an amazing veteran, Martin Sugarman, he's British, Jewish. He's been fighting the town council there for 20
For
years.
the information they pass out when people,
Yeah,
it's
for
the
the
brochure.
The brochure doesn't even talk about them being Jewish, about the X-Troop. Like, it's completely negated. And he's been fighting them for 20 years, and they have refused to put the word Jewish on it. So what he did about 6 months ago, I think when with the book coming out, was he commissioned a local artist to do a brass Star of David at the base of the memorial. So we always say to everybody, he says, and I say, if you go there, just bring some Stars of David. So now there's a bunch of Stars of David at the bottom, and it's a continual battle. There was a whole Welsh newspaper review of the book that said, look, we need to start to reconsider this memorial.
So maybe the book and its
I hope
publicity
so.
will help
Yeah,
that.
I really hope so, because it's really, and also he emailed me last week that one of the Jews who was buried under a cross, one of their family members contacted me, who didn't know about the details, read the book, and said, I don't want my family member buried under a cross. And so Martin Sugarman got the local community to commission, and they've just reinterred the body under a Star of David, which is incredible, this weekend, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. So yeah.
It's amazing the impact that this book
I'm
has
hoping
had.
so.
And
Yeah.
perhaps will continue to have.
Yeah, especially with that memorial. Yeah.
Well, we're into our question and answer period. Unless anything you want to add before we get into that we haven't covered?
No, I love hearing questions, so I'm good to get questions.
Okay. Oh, this is a great question. And this is from Zoom. Are these stories what inspired Inglorious Bastards?
So that is a great question, Zoom audience member. So when Inglorious Bastards came out, those commandos who were still alive, and at that point there was a handful of commandos still alive, were furious about the movie because, I didn't mention this, but when they were fighting in the war, these Jewish commandos followed the rules of war, were totally ethical. Their whole stance was that we are more ethical than them, meaning Jews are more ethical than Germans, and they never did revenge. They did everything properly, and so they hated Inglorious Bastards because they thought that it was like a revenge fantasy presentation and the opposite of what they were doing. And Peter Masters, the guy in the Bicycle Troupe, his daughter, Kim Masters, is a reporter for the Hollywood Reporter, and she wrote a great editorial, which you can Google, saying, my dad, the real Inglorious Bastard, really taking that movie to task for it. I don't think Tarantino meant to, I don't think it was intentional on his part, it was just clearly a revenge fantasy, but these guys were really hurt by it because they said, we didn't do revenge, we did the rules of war. And they were aware of it, and
No, that's great. Are there more? Oh. This is from the audience. Was there contact between this group and the Jewish Brigade? Oh, and the Bricha organization?
Okay, that is a great question.
That's another great question.
So I write a little bit about the Jewish Brigade in the book. The Jewish Brigade, they came out, they show up really late in the war, and they actually didn't really accomplish much of anything. They were in the Italian campaign, and I don't blame the Jewish Brigade. I blame the British Army, because if the British Army had trained the Jewish Brigade the way they trained the X-Troopers, they could have been monumentally important. But they were so separated, there was no impact. And people always ask, well, what about with Israel? Was there any sort of connection between these guys and the Israeli forces? There wasn't whatsoever. There was no. They were completely separate. There's a few of the people emigrated to Israel after the war, but these sort of tough warrior Jews of the UK were completely different and separate from sort of the Israeli manifestation of it. And so there was no cross contact between them.
Just in time. Why did the troopers in the United States live as Jews while those in Britain did not?
It's funny. Like I said, I was talking to Ian Harris's son, Mark Harris, a couple days ago, and I asked him that question, and he said that one of the things I talk about in the book was that because these guys were all Holocaust survivors, and then when they went and had children, they did the natural thing of being nervous for their kids. And I think for a lot of them, they thought that the children would be safer, simply don't acknowledge we're Jewish, be more British than the Brits, protect the kids. So I think a lot of it was a means of survival with that trauma. And I also think that's another reason why they kept their new names, almost all of them, because it was sort of the way in Israel people change their names, a way to disassociate from the past. And I think in the United States, there was a sense that this kind of undercurrent of anti-Semitism wasn't here, that one could sort of be who one wanted to be. This was the Die Goldene Medina. We can do what we want here. And it's really pretty stark the way that the two different communities raised their kids. Like I said, most of the British commandos didn't talk to their kids about being Jewish. One of the kids said to me, I didn't know I was Jewish till I went to a bar mitzvah of a cousin. I was like, wait, I have a cousin who's having a bar mitzvah? Dad, what's that about? So most of them, I also think a lot of it was in the UK, it was just still so close to them. And to talk to their kids about their own parents who were like killed in the Lodge Ghetto or wherever they were killed was just too painful. So most of the British kids told me that their dads would sort of talk to them about the war, but they wouldn't talk about the pre-war stuff.
But they did know they'd been Jewish previously, or did they?
The kids of the commandos?
Yeah.
Most of them didn't know.
So how did the commandos explain having no immediate family?
It was sort of like don't ask, don't tell. The kids kind of knew there was errors we don't talk about.
Yeah, you just didn't ask.
Yeah. And so most of the kids, when they're hitting like 14, 15, at that age when you start asking questions, that's when it starts to come out that there's this whole other story with their fathers. And there's this whole other stories about why they might not have grandparents too.
Any more questions? No? Oh.
Any other questions?
I have one more question. Did any of the grandchildren or children who've discovered, or maybe probably the children who, when they discovered their father was originally Jewish, did anyone suddenly realize, because they had that heritage, did they, in Britain, I guess, did they become interested in it and re-engage?
Most of them became really excited by it and like interested in their history, but not all of them. Another story I didn't really talk about now, which is the story of the crosses, those who are buried under crosses and those who are buried under Stars of David. Martin Sugarman, that guy who has been fighting the memorial and putting the Stars of David there, also has been the person fighting to get the crosses turned to Stars of David. And we have a whole list of those ex-troopers who are buried under
They know where
crosses.
they are.
Yeah, we know who they are. We know where they are. And a number of their families don't want it turned to Stars of David. And I don't want to go into too detail, but I actually heard from two sons in one family still fighting the battle of how Jewish are we, how overt. And it's really interesting in that particular case, the son who wants to keep it as a cross is in Europe, and the son who wants to is in America. So it's still a continuing difficult memory problem for many of the families.
Do you, moving forward with this, it sounds like this has generated a lot of really interesting responses and renewed interest in certain pieces of history. Do you feel like, I know it mentions in the book that there were some documents that were not declassified. When will there be another wave of documents that are declassified which would add, would you go back and maybe revise it or add or do something additionally?
The main information I don't know about, and I see she has one more question. The main information I don't have, the main time period I cannot get enough information about is the parachuting behind enemy lines. That's the stuff, like the D-Day I have tons of material on, Battle of the Bulge, all that stuff I have all the material on. But all the top secret stuff they did right before the war, like plots, there's apparently a plot to assassinate Hitler that was part of this, but I can't do, everything I wrote in the book, I had to get the proof from the war diaries. There were war diaries the British kept to make sure that all the memories people had actually matched the historical. So I think that's where most of the material is, the sort of top secret stuff they did in the lead up to the war that will be declassified at some point that I think will fill in the story a lot. Because a lot of the guys talked about it, but they didn't give details about it. So
how long do they have to wait? I mean, is there a certain...
We can go, which I did, you can go and you can request things to be declassified, but a lot of them aren't being declassified for like 50 more years. So I got a lot of stuff declassified, but not all of it.
And did they have to sign the official Secrets Act?
They did. And they did not want to talk about this stuff. And they spent their whole lives not talking about this stuff. So a lot of the material I had to get through deep archival digs into war diaries and other places.
With everything closed.
With everything closed, yes. And interviewing kids and their families and finding, another great thing I found was diaries and finding diaries that sort of describe things.
We have another question from Zoom. Who were the commandos who were still alive whom you were able to interview?
That's a great question. Okay, so one of them was Paul Streeton, who, anyone who does economics, which is probably no one here, but he was a hugely important economist. And I was having lunch with a friend at Hunter who's an economics professor, and I mentioned Paul Streeton, and she said, "Oh my God, Paul Streeton, he was an ex-trooper? I never knew." So he landed at Sicily. He was incredible. I got to interview him through his daughter because he was quite sick at the point of writing the book. He unfortunately passed away while I was writing the book. The other commando I interviewed was, I heard a rumor that there was another commando alive, and he didn't want to talk about any of this stuff. So I got him to agree to let me fly to his home and interview him, as long as I promised when I wrote the book I wouldn't use his real name, I wouldn't use his nom de guerre, I would come up with a fake third name for him, because he had never told anyone that, as he told me, his parents disappeared without a trace during the Holocaust. He never told anyone he was from Germany, and he had pretended to be that British commando who he became. So I write about him in the book, and he showed me the letter from Brian Hilton Jones. And then, unfortunately, he passed away about 2 months ago. And I talked to his wife, and I said, should we start to say his name? And we discussed, and we decided we're going to give him 5 years, and then I'll start saying his.
But his wife knew.
His wife knew, but nobody else knew. Literally nobody else knew about this. Because I think for him, it was just too painful.
It's from where? Oh, this is another Zoom question. How old were the Jews on the Kindertransport to become members of X Troop? So, I guess.
I understand the question.
Yeah.
Because Kindertransport is usually children. And so it's unusual. The timing seems weird to be with the Kindertransport.
Well, some of them were teenagers.
Yeah, so the ones in my book who are in the Kindertransport are the maximum oldest age you can be. So 17 and 16. So they're not children. So most of the X-troopers who come on Kindertransport, the Kindertransport will often decide to take one kid who's a bit older, like a teenager, to help the person with the younger kids. So that's who the X-troopers will be, the 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds who go on the Kindertransport. And the rest of them just come by themselves, like sneak through the countries and make their way on a transit visa.
And this is a great question. What kind of lessons did you in doing this? I'm sure it was sort of transformative in a lot of ways. In the end, when you were kind of done, how did it change how you feel about certain things, or sort of your outlook on certain parts of history and that kind of thing?
So primarily 2 ways. One, CNN asked me to write an editorial for them about 6 months ago about what I learned from the X Troop. And at that point, what I said I had learned, which was true, was the importance of refugees and how important it is that people can come in and transform the world, because these guys knew what evil looked like, and then they came and they could deal with evil because they knew what it looked like, and they could make Britain better for it. But I will add that in the last 6 months, the other thing I have learned from this is, because I have been fighting a battle against sort of the BDS stuff and the anti-Israel stuff. Probably shouldn't go into it, but I've just been dealing with that stuff, as many of us do. The other lesson I get from this is that Jews have to fight back. And this is what these guys did, and that in these dark times of anti-Semitism, I think it's what we have to do. So I often think a bit about them. I don't know if they'd agree with me politically about how I feel about that stuff, but I do think that they are a really good lesson that the world. That's why I also want people to get the book for everyone they know for Hanukkah, because this is Jews fighting back, and that's what we need to remember right now. So it's made me much more fierce as well. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, I mean, these are really strong role models.
Strong men, strong Jewish men.
These are tough guys.
Tough guys, and I think that's what we need. I really do. So,
No, I think that's an excellent
yeah.
thing. And it'll be interesting to see, you probably haven't stopped learning from this whole experience.
Yeah,
I bet.
I haven't. I hear from the guys all the time, the kids all the time.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
And how are they feeling about, I mean, I know you sent it to them. Are they proud of the book?
I have to say they love it because, like, when I interviewed all of them, it was sort of like they were all saying, we're just waiting for somebody we want to tell somebody about our dads. So they were so excited about the book. And what I kept hearing from them after the book came out was that the book filled in a lot of pieces about their fathers that they didn't know about. Because their fathers told them some stuff, but I would find out way more material in the war diaries than they knew about. So for a lot of them, interestingly, reading the book filled in a lot of the picture of who their fathers were, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's terrific. Do you think that anybody will ever mount an exhibit of
I'm hoping I'm trying to get the Holocaust Museum too, but we'll see.
Or maybe the Imperial War Museum.
Or the Imperial War. Oh my God, that's a great idea. Or the Imperial War Museum. Yeah.
From Zoom, did the ex-troop who landed on D-Day fight the soldiers, or did they do sabotage missions?
They did both. So they fought the soldier. It's really interesting. So by day, they fought the soldiers. By landing at night, they would go and do sabotage missions behind enemy lines. These guys were working 24/7. So while everyone else is sleeping, by day they're doing the normal battles, and then they're going behind enemy lines. They're, helping smuggle out partisans. They're doing, bombs in different locations. So they're doing both. So they're doing the day fighting and the sabotage at night.
They just didn't sleep.
No, they didn't sleep. It was too important what they were doing.
Well, I think that is all of our time. I'm going to do a quick close, but before I do that, I just want to thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We could probably talk another hour because this stuff is so amazing. And if you're not a huge World War II fan, it's not only a great story, it's a great introduction to basic World War II. I mean, I don't want to reduce it down to that, but it's very, very digestible. So again, thank you so much for coming. And this is Leah's first time down here. I told her she needs to come back.
I'd love to.
And I want to also thank our patrons of the arts and the Jaffe family for their continued support of the Leah and Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival, and everyone who joined us today, both on air and in person. And we look forward to seeing you at some of our upcoming events. We have a whole lot more. The next one is November 4th with Robert Lefkowitz, the author of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. And the details can be found at jewishva.org/bookfest. And if you're here, please stop by after this presentation because Leah will be in the Cardo signing books. So again, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.